The screech of sirens cut through our sleepy cul-de-sac like a war cry, lights flashing off HOA manicured hedges and garden gnomes. Military trucks idled by my house while a swarm of local police cruisers boxed them in. Over by the mailboxes stood Karen, arms crossed, lips twisted in self-satisfaction, and her iPhone still warm from dialing 911. She didn't know she'd just summoned half the county to question an armed forces convoy on federal assignment. And the best part? She thought she was the hero. I stood on my front porch, coffee in hand, watching the chaos unfold like it was Saturday morning cartoons. Karen had no clue what kind of convoy she'd tried to shut down, or who I really was. But she was about to find out. It had started as a perfectly normal Tuesday. I just finished my morning workout, had eggs and toast, and was prepping for a high-level delivery through my company. I run a Department of Defense-certified logistics firm that transports emergency gear, mobile comms units, and high-clearance tech for disaster response teams. My neighborhood, Evergreen Pines, isn't exactly the ideal spot for it, but after retirement, I liked the peace and proximity to my daughter's school. That peace, however, came with a loud, nosy price tag, Karen. She was the HOA vice president, self-appointed head of compliance, and the kind of woman who once reported a kid for chalk drawings on a sidewalk she didn't even own. She policed grass height with a measuring tape and kept binoculars in her window to track violations. Naturally, she had a personal vendetta against me for not joining the HOA. So when the convoy arrived, 3 military-grade trucks, a pair of Humvees, and an unmarked SUV, Karen must have thought she'd won the suburban lottery of drama. I heard her gasp before I even saw her. From my porch, I watched her scamper across the street, filming on her phone like she was the star of her own Netflix crime doc. The drivers, uniformed, calm, and all very official, were coordinating on radios while checking manifest sheet. It was clockwork precision. To Karen, though, it must have looked like the Red Dawn reboot. I could hear her shouting something about illegal occupation and armed intrusion. She wasn't even subtle, marching up to the lead driver and snapping photos 2 feet from his face. When he politely told her to step back for safety reasons, she stormed off and pulled out her phone. Now, I knew she'd done something stupid the moment the police sirens kicked in. Not just one cruiser, 5. Then a supervisor unit. Then a K9 truck. Then, God help us, a local news van pulled up, alerted by someone on the police scanner. Karen was waving them all down like she'd cracked open a national security scandal. I stopped a militia, she proudly told a deputy, pointing to my driveway. They're using this neighborhood to hide military-style equipment. That's illegal. The deputy was trying his best not to laugh. I walked up calmly and introduced myself. Sir, I said, you're interfering with a pre-authorized federal delivery. All papers are in my home office. May I retrieve them? One of the officers asked for ID. I handed over my contractor badge issued by the Department of Defense. The officer's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed at Karen. Ma'am, he said dryly, you called in a false report on a federal logistics convoy. That's obstruction. Karen blinked like she'd been slapped. But they've got guns, she stammered. And those trucks? They're transporting communications equipment and disaster response rations for FEMA-certified storage, I explained, holding up a clipboard. This is part of Operation Backstream, and I have the clearance to confirm that. Also, the men you harassed? Active-duty National Guard personnel on duty rotation. Karen's mouth moved, but no sound came out. For once, she was speechless. The deputy didn't stop there. You realize you delayed a time-sensitive mission? He asked her. This could have real consequences. She turned red, then purple. I was protecting the community, she cried. From who? I asked. The people delivering clean water filters? It didn't take long for the news crew to sniff out the real story. The reporter, a young guy with a mic and way too much gel in his hair, asked if I'd be willing to go on record. I politely declined, but Karen, Oh, Karen couldn't resist. She jumped in front of the camera like a moth to a flame. I acted because I saw something wrong, she said, dramatically. This neighborhood is for families, not for military activity. Ma'am, the reporter said slowly, we're being told this was a scheduled operation that supports civilian emergency prep centers. Karen paused, trying to recover. Well, it wasn't approved by the HOA. And there it was, the golden line. Not approved by the HOA. Never mind the Pentagon, FEMA, or Homeland Security. If it didn't have Karen's signature in blue ink, it didn't count. The absurdity of it made me smile. But what I didn't expect was what came next. While most of the police cleared out after verifying credentials, 2 military officers remained. They approached me calmly, introduced themselves as liaison observers, and asked if I wanted to escalate the situation. Escalate? I asked, confused. Her actions may have interfered with a national operation, one said. Depending on how far it delayed us, she could be looking at civil fines or more. Karen overheard and immediately started screaming about her right. I didn't push it yet. Instead, I said something I knew would sting. She's just the HOA vice president. She doesn't speak for me. The convoy resumed unloading equipment, carrying crates to the side of my house. Karen, meanwhile, stood stunned, humiliated, and visibly twitching with outrage as her neighbors gathered to watch. A few whispered. One man asked if he could take a selfie with the Humvee. Another joked about starting a petition to nominate me for neighborhood MVP. For once, the crowd wasn't on her side. I thought it would end there. I thought Karen had learned her lesson. But this was Karen. By sundown, she was already cooking up a plan, one that would try to twist this whole thing into a scandal. What she didn't know, though, was that she had just poked a bear far larger than a few trucks or officers. This wasn't just about a delivery. She'd interfered with an operation under federal classification. And while I didn't want revenge, the machine she tried to weaponize, rules, authority, order, was about to come crashing down on her. Because the military doesn't forget. And neither do I. The sun had barely risen the next day when I heard the clatter of something shoved under my front door. A tri-folded letter, HOA logo stamped proudly on the corner, sat on my welcome mat like a threat wrapped in recycled paper. I already knew who was behind it, even before I saw the signature. Karen, Vice President of Evergreen Pines HOA, with all the self-importance of a royal decree, had delivered a formal citation accusing me of violating community standards by inviting a military presence without prior notice. I laughed out loud. Inviting a military presence? It was a federal operation. The convoy was sanctioned, scheduled, and cleared by agencies far above her petty neighborhood rules. But she was doubling down, and I knew this was just the start. The citation was worded like a war memo. It referenced community distress, unannounced military activity, and even cited an obscure clause about disruptive vehicular traffic. Karen had really done her homework, or, more likely, she'd stayed up all night crafting nonsense with her Google tabs open and a mug of wine at her side. The cherry on top was the demand at the bottom. I was to attend an emergency HOA meeting that evening to address concerns from the board and community members. It read less like a summons and more like a warning shot. Karen wasn't just embarrassed, she was angry. Her pride had been bruised publicly, and now she was clawing back control the only way she knew how, through meetings, motions, and made-up mandates. I showed up to the clubhouse at 6 sharp. The room was packed. Not because people were upset, but because word had spread. Everyone wanted to see what Karen would try next. Some were clutching mugs of coffee, others leaned in with popcorn-level anticipation. The tension wasn't angry, it was buzzing with curiosity. I took a seat in the back corner and watched the circus unfold. Karen, already seated at the board's long oak table, adjusted her glasses like she was about to sentence me in a courtroom drama. She cleared her throat and called the meeting to order. Tonight's topic, she said solemnly, is the unauthorized military convoy that disrupted the Evergreen Pines community. She made sure to enunciate every syllable, like she was reading a headline from a scandal tabloid. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. One guy, Jim, the treasurer, looked like he wanted to melt into his folding chair. Karen launched into a monologue about public safety, residential tranquility, and something she called neighborhood trauma. She claimed several residents had suffered emotional distress from seeing men in uniforms and large trucks near their lawns. She passed around a stack of printed photos she'd taken. Zoomed in, grainy shots of the convoy parked in my driveway. One of the board members asked, "Isn't that the same delivery that had police and a federal escort?" Karen hesitated, then said, "Yes, but no one consulted the board. That's the problem." It was at that moment I stood up. "Karen," I said, "you called the police on a legally sanctioned federal delivery. You reported trained service members as hostile militia. And now you want to fine me for it." She snapped back, "This is about process, Logan. Protocol. There are rules in this community." "No," I replied, calmly but firmly. "There are federal rules that override your garden club's power trip." A few people chuckled. Karen's face turned red. She fumbled with a binder, flipping to a page. According to Section 4B of the Residential Disruption Policy, any prolonged presence of heavy vehicles must be approved by the board at least 72 hours in advance. Jim finally spoke up. "Karen, that policy's about moving trucks, not FEMA convoys." Karen glared at him. "It's the principle of the matter." Someone in the back whispered loudly, "The principle of being wrong?" More laughter. Karen pounded the table with a pen. "Enough. If Logan refuses to acknowledge the board's concerns, we will be forced to issue a community-wide violation notice and pursue disciplinary action." "Disciplinary action?" I said. "Do you think you're the government?" She stared at me coldly and said, "If the government won't hold you accountable, we will." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. It was so audacious, so delusional, that no one knew how to respond. I looked around the room, then calmly walked up to the table and placed a folder in front of her. "These are the signed federal authorizations, including the Department of Defense manifest. The operation was classified until completed. And you tried to stop it." Karen looked at the documents like they were written in another language. Her hands trembled slightly. She didn't know what to do with facts. Her whole power relied on perception and the illusion of control. She tried one more jab. "So what now? You expect us to just forgive this disruption?" "No," I said. "I expect you to stay out of things you don't understand. Because next time, it might not just be paperwork." There was no official vote. The meeting broke down into quiet murmurs and awkward shuffling. People started to leave. I returned home that night not just frustrated, but genuinely concerned. Because Karen wasn't done. You could see it in her eyes. She was humiliated, sure, but also determined. She would twist this into something else. And I wasn't wrong. 2 days later, a new letter arrived. This time from a so-called watchdog organization Karen claimed to have contacted. It was printed on cheap paper with a fake seal, claiming to be from the Department of Neighborhood Affairs. She had invented a government agency. The letter said I was under investigation for weaponized logistics abuse. I nearly choked on my coffee laughing. My wife, Miranda, who had stayed quiet through most of this, finally asked, "Is she serious?" "Oh, she's very serious," I said. "But it's time we stop playing nice." That afternoon, I made a few phone calls. One to a friend at the Office of Military Logistics, another to a former colleague at Homeland Security. Not to escalate, but to document. I explained that a civilian HOA was actively interfering with federal transport. I didn't ask for retaliation. I just opened the door for oversight. And then I waited. Meanwhile, Karen had taken her act online. She posted on the neighborhood's private social media group, ranting about military intimidation, and posted cropped images to make it look like the trucks were threatening. But her biggest mistake came when she uploaded bodycam footage she claimed came from an inside source. The only problem? It was spliced video from an old TV news segment, easily debunked. Comments flooded in calling her out. People began to turn on her. But Karen kept digging. She knocked on neighbors' doors, trying to build support for a vote to remove me from the community. She failed. She tried to get the HOA to sue me for unlawful infrastructure impact. That failed too. Every move she made, she doubled down harder, and fell flat harder. But the thing about people like Karen is that they don't recognize when the game has changed. She still thought she was playing HOA bingo. What she didn't see coming was that her little vendetta had now drawn the attention of real federal oversight. The wheels were already in motion. What she thought was a fight about neighborhood rules was about to become a lesson in jurisdiction. She thought she was in control. But soon, she'd learn what happens when you interfere with the wrong delivery. The following Monday morning started with a knock on the door that sounded different, measured, confident, and backed by authority. I opened it to find a woman in full military dress uniform standing at attention on my porch. Behind her were two sharply dressed individuals carrying briefcases and IDs. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Colonel Adeline Briggs, United States Army, Division of Civil Military Coordination. The moment Karen saw the government vehicle outside my house, she came speed-walking across the street like a middle school hall monitor on a power trip. I could practically hear her blood pressure rising. The colonel didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded politely and turned back to me. "We need to speak with you about last week's incident and the unauthorized civilian interference in a secure operation," she said. I invited them inside while Karen hovered just outside my property line like a guard dog with a clipboard. Once inside, the colonel and her team briefed me on the chain of events. The delivery that Karen had disrupted was part of a logistical stress test in conjunction with national emergency preparedness protocols. Apparently, it was tied to a FEMA communications backup hub that the state was quietly building out. My location had been selected weeks in advance due to its proximity to critical zones and its unobstructed access route. The Convoy had been running a live simulation, clocked and monitored to test response time, route stability, and civilian interaction. Karen's interference hadn't just delayed a delivery. It had created a data breach in the simulation's integrity, and more importantly, it had initiated a wave of internal reviews. "We're not here to place blame," the colonel said firmly, "but we are here to gather evidence for a formal report. If necessary, we will be escalating this to the Department of Justice." I nodded, a bit stunned. I hadn't expected it to rise this far, but I wasn't surprised either. I explained the entire chain of events, showed them the HOA citations, and even pulled up the phony Department of Neighborhood Affairs letter Karen had mailed. One of the men, an attorney from military legal, snapped a photo of it and whispered something to his colleague. As we wrapped up the discussion, I heard the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice, yelling from my yard. "I demand to speak to whoever's in charge," she shouted. "This is a community matter, and I have legal standing." The colonel raised an eyebrow and calmly walked out the front door, clipboard in hand. Karen was standing in my flower bed, pointing dramatically like she was directing traffic. The colonel, unshaken, approached her slowly. "Ma'am," she said, "you are currently trespassing on private property. I advise you step back immediately." Karen scoffed. "You don't intimidate me. I have every right to know what's going on. I'm the acting compliance head of this neighborhood." The colonel glanced down at her clipboard, then back up at Karen. "And I am a senior officer conducting a federal review. You may file an information request through the proper civilian-military channels. Until then, this matter does not involve your authority." Karen looked like someone had slapped her with the Constitution. Her face contorted into a frown so deep it might have left a permanent line. "I'm calling my attorney," she growled. "This is harassment." The colonel turned back toward me with a soft sigh. "Expect a follow-up," she said. "And I would advise installing exterior cameras if you haven't already. These situations have a way of escalating." The team departed with professional efficiency, leaving Karen frozen in place, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She didn't say another word, but I could see her gears turning. Her plan had just collided with a reality she didn't understand, and her instincts were to lash out. That afternoon, she posted another rant in the community group, claiming my property was now a military target, and that neighbors should begin filing formal grievances to protect their homes from government intrusion. She attached a dramatic photo of the colonel's car with a caption that read, "Militarization of our safe spaces? Say no to tyranny." But what she didn't know was that her antics had now become part of the investigation. The legal division had flagged her posts for possible interference and defamation. As it turns out, when you knowingly misrepresent a federal operation and incite public unrest, it's not just embarrassing, it's actionable. The following evening, I received a call from Colonel Briggs. She asked if I would be willing to provide a few more documents, including any public posts or citations that reference the convoy or any threats made against its personnel. I forwarded screenshots, including Karen's livestream and her posts on the neighborhood platform. She thanked me and said, "You might want to keep your week flexible. This is getting pulled up the chain." The phrase stuck with me. Pulled up the chain. It wasn't just a local report anymore. Whatever Karen had stirred up was now inching closer to real consequences. I stayed low for a few days, but Karen didn't. She started walking around with a laminated badge clipped to her HOA lanyard like she was part of law enforcement. I saw her trying to stop a school bus one afternoon, yelling something about unapproved vehicle routes. She was spiraling, and everyone knew it. But things reached a new level of absurd when she tried to present herself as an expert in military protocol. At a small neighborhood meeting, one she organized herself at the clubhouse, Karen brought out a projector, a pie chart, and a manila envelope labeled "Proof of Unlawful Militarization." She had printed screenshots of Google Maps with vague shapes she claimed were camouflaged assets, and even included images of my backyard shed. She called it a possible storage bunker. When someone asked if she had any formal training, Karen said she had taken a weekend workshop on Homeland Security awareness, online, from an unaccredited source. She even handed out pamphlets that looked like they'd been printed at a gas station. But the biggest laugh of the night came when she tried to explain the Geneva Conventions to a retired Navy officer who lived 2 blocks away. He didn't say a word. He just stood up, saluted the room, and walked out shaking his head. After that, the audience thinned out quickly, leaving Karen surrounded by folding chairs and disappointment. I could have laughed it all off, but I knew better. People like Karen don't just retreat. They regroup. That's exactly what she did. She started petitioning for a new HOA bylaw that would restrict federal activity without board notification. She posted flyers, cornered neighbors, and started threatening fines for people who supported me. What she didn't realize was that several neighbors had already forwarded her threats to the same military legal office that visited me. Her attempts at control had turned into a trail of harassment. By the end of the week, I received a quiet text from one of my old contacts who worked in Washington. It was short, just 5 words. "You're about to be vindicated." I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I had a strong feeling that whatever Karen had started had officially snowballed out of her hands. She thought she was fighting a neighbor. She didn't realize she'd picked a fight with a system designed to track, analyze, and respond with precision. Her little fake agency letter, her live streams, her pamphlets, every single piece was now evidence. The envelope arrived in a thick, embossed packet sealed with a federal stamp. It wasn't slid under my door like one of Karen's HOA notes or dropped in the mailbox with a passive-aggressive sticky tab. It was hand-delivered by a uniformed courier and required my signature. The letterhead read, "Department of Homeland Security." I sat down on the porch swing and read through it, feeling both amused and vindicated. It was an official notice of review regarding civilian interference in federally protected operations, citing specific incidents within Evergreen Pines. The notice stated that the department was launching a community-level review to investigate disruptions and violations of national preparedness protocols. I didn't even have to guess who the primary subject of interest was. Karen's name appeared in a separate attachment titled, Reported Civilian Actors. Word traveled faster than fire through dry grass. That afternoon, neighbors started getting letters too, though theirs were more general, notifying them that DHS would be temporarily conducting a community readiness assessment as part of a broader initiative. No names were listed, but the buzz around who triggered it was loud and unanimous. Some thought it was a drill. Others thought a national emergency was coming. Karen, of course, took it personally and tried to spin it like she was the one who called in the oversight. I overheard her outside, bragging to someone over the phone that she forced Homeland Security's hand and was going to clean up the neighborhood. She didn't realize she was the reason they were coming. By Tuesday morning, federal vans were parked around Evergreen Pines. Men and women in suits and polos moved efficiently, speaking into earpieces, going door to door with surveys and quick interviews. They weren't intrusive, but their presence was undeniable. Karen marched down the street wearing a flag pin and a stack of folders, trying to insert herself into every conversation. I watched her approach one DHS officer and introduce herself as the acting community representative, only for him to calmly correct her that the HOA had no jurisdiction over federal operations. She tried again with someone else, waving her HOA badge like it meant something. That agent barely glanced at it and continued interviewing a family about emergency preparedness. You could see the confusion and frustration rising in her like steam from a tea kettle about to blow. Things only got worse when the convoy returned, not as a delivery but as part of a scheduled urban readiness drill. This time, it wasn't just my driveway. The trucks used 3 locations in the neighborhood to simulate temporary response bases. Traffic was redirected. Drones buzzed overhead for aerial documentation. Officers guided cars around orange cones. The air was filled with coordination chatter and the hum of surveillance equipment being tested. It was all part of the protocol. It was also, indirectly, Karen's doing. Because of her interference, Evergreen Pines had been fast-tracked for operational stress testing to assess how communities react under compromised leadership. Karen came storming down the street the moment the lead truck parked near the clubhouse. She was yelling before she even reached the sidewalk. "I didn't authorize this," she screamed. "This is a private neighborhood." One of the convoy supervisors calmly told her she was interfering with a federal readiness operation and that failure to comply would be reported. She doubled down, demanding to speak to a superior. Moments later, who stepped out of the lead vehicle but Lieutenant Colonel Briggs. Karen froze, her mouth hanging open as the colonel approached, this time with a full document folder and a prepared statement. "Ms. Hargrove," Briggs said, formal and steady, "as previously advised, your continued interference has been documented and reviewed by multiple departments. This site has been selected as a critical checkpoint in a readiness assessment. Your authorization is neither required nor valid." Karen stammered something about private land and community jurisdiction, to which the colonel handed her a signed warrant granting temporary federal access to the area under the Stafford Act. Karen looked at the seal and signature, her face draining of color. "This can't be legal," she muttered, backing away. "It's not only legal," said Briggs, "it's binding. And I'd suggest you keep a respectful distance unless you want to be detained." It was like watching a balloon deflate. Karen turned and walked away briskly, muttering to herself. The neighbors stood watching from porches and sidewalks, silent but wide-eyed. Many of them started whispering and texting, some taking discreet photos. Karen had gone from local tyrant to national embarrassment in record time. By the afternoon, a news crew arrived, this time sent by a regional affiliate tipped off by the increased federal presence. A reporter began shooting footage near the entrance to the neighborhood. When asked for a comment, Karen predictably inserted herself into the shot, claiming that she had been the whistleblower who alerted authorities. She said she was working tirelessly to ensure Evergreen Pines didn't become a militarized zone. What she didn't know was that the news crew had already received a briefing packet from DHS, which contradicted her entire narrative. Moments after her interview, they aired a summary on social media that painted a very different picture. Local HOA leader under review for obstructing federal operations. The comments section exploded. Her own neighbors began resharing the clip with laughing emojis. That evening, the neighborhood Facebook group turned into a war zone. Screenshots of Karen's bogus letter from the Department of Neighborhood Affairs were posted by a neighbor who had been quietly collecting evidence. Someone else uploaded her rant about Geneva Conventions from the clubhouse meeting. A few veterans in the community publicly denounced her behavior, reminding everyone how dangerous it was to spread misinformation about active duty personnel. One post read, "She embarrassed the entire neighborhood, and now we're on a list because of it." The final blow came when a formal audit of the HOA board's conduct was announced. Due to multiple complaints and reports of misuse of power, Evergreen Pines HOA was being reviewed for possible mismanagement and abuse of position. A separate letter went out informing residents that the board's activities would be temporarily frozen pending the outcome. Karen's kingdom was collapsing, and it was happening in slow motion for everyone to see. I sat on my back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sun dip below the rooftops while a couple of National Guard vehicles passed quietly along the street. The same neighbors who once feared retaliation from Karen now waved at the soldiers, asked questions about their gear, and offered bottled water. Kids were even taking photos with the convoy crew. The fear was gone. In its place was a sense of grounded reality, something that had been missing under Karen's iron-fisted interpretation of control. That night, I got a text from one of the legal officers who had visited with Brig. It was a single sentence: "Expect board shakeup soon." I didn't need more detail. Karen was about to face the consequences she had spent years doling out to others. It was almost poetic how the final curtain fell. No alarms, no last-minute tantrums, just a soft, anticlimactic whimper from someone who had once ruled our cul-de-sac like a self-declared dictator. The week after Homeland Security packed up and left, everything in Evergreen Pines felt different. The air was lighter, the sidewalks weren't patrolled by Karen's paranoid walks, and for the first time since I moved here, neighbors smiled without scanning for surveillance cameras hidden in hanging planters. The HOA board held an emergency vote that Friday, and though the meeting was meant to be private, word spread fast that Karen's position had been officially dissolved. 3 board members resigned, one of them mid-meeting after admitting he only stayed on the board because Karen threatened to report him for an unpermitted mailbox upgrade. I wasn't surprised. She had run the place like it was a one-woman show. A week later, the HOA office at the community clubhouse was locked. A small notice taped to the door read, "Administrative hold pending investigation." That was all it said, but it carried the weight of everything that had transpired. Karen's influence had vanished overnight. Her ridiculous letters, fines, veiled threats, they all meant nothing now. She wasn't seen outside for several days, and when she did finally appear, she was dressed in muted colors, no clipboard, no sunglasses, no HOA lanyard. Just Karen, stripped of her imaginary power, walking to her mailbox like any other resident. I saw her from across the street and gave a polite nod. She looked at me, hesitated, then quickly turned away. That silence was louder than all her previous complaints combined. Of course, the neighborhood wasn't going to let it end on such a dry note. A few neighbors had cooked up a celebration that felt more like a declaration of freedom than a party. It started with a few lawn chairs and a grill, but it quickly turned into something much larger. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. People brought tables, coolers, lights, and games. Someone set up a bounce house for the kids. Others set out trays of food. What made it special, though, wasn't just the food or music. It was the company. Veterans, young families, older couples, and even newcomers all gathered in one place, many of whom had been on the receiving end of Karen's authoritarian interpretations of HOA codes. It felt like a long overdue reunion. At the center of it all was the grill, manned by none other than Sergeant Lopez, one of the convoy drivers who had returned with the drill team. He and a few others from the National Guard had come back for the event, not in uniform, but as honorary guests. Their families joined too. One of the kids wore a t-shirt that read, "My dad drives the big truck Karen called the cops on." Everyone had a laugh over that. I offered a toast midway through the evening, raising my glass and saying, "To community, to truth, and to never mistaking a clipboard for actual power." That got a few claps and a loud amen from someone near the punch table. But the best moment came when a neighbor named Elliot wheeled out a wooden post with a small metal plaque attached to it. He hammered it gently into the grass at the edge of my driveway, right where the first convoy truck had parked weeks ago. The plaque read, "Designated Federal Drop Point, Evergreen Pines Sector." It was clearly homemade, a little crooked, but beautiful in its symbolism. The crowd erupted with laughter. Even the colonel, who had shown up in plain clothes later that evening, cracked a genuine smile. Karen wasn't at the event, of course. She was holed up in her house, curtains drawn. But I'd heard from a friend who saw her peeking through her blinds for hours, watching every detail unfold. By the following Monday, the story had gone national. The regional affiliate that initially covered the convoy came back to do a follow-up piece. This time they came with a crew and a drone camera. They interviewed neighbors, filmed the plaque, and even asked me if I wanted to go on camera. I agreed this time, not to attack Karen, but to speak on something bigger. I talked about how fragile trust becomes in a community when power is abused. I talked about how easy it is to let someone speak on your behalf until they speak something you never agreed to. And I talked about how leadership, real leadership, always knows when to listen before acting. The clip aired that same night. Within hours, it was trending under the hashtag #KarenConvoy. Karen's reaction, predictably, was to file a complaint to the news station, claiming she was being defamed and harassed. But she had no legal ground to stand on. The news outlet had DHS clearance, federal statements, and multiple verified sources. Everything had been fact-checked and documented. Her complaint never even got a reply. Her final desperate move was to call a town hall meeting. Only 3 people showed up. One was her, the second was a neighbor who just wanted to use the bathroom, and the third was a teenager who thought it was a gaming club meetup. After that, she went silent. A for sale sign appeared in front of her home less than 2 weeks later. She didn't host an open house or attend any showings. She didn't wave goodbye. She packed up during the night, movers arriving just before dawn. Her SUV followed them out sometime before breakfast. By the time the sun rose, the house was empty and Karen was gone. Her exit wasn't dramatic. There were no goodbye letters or parting jabs. Just the echo of her absence and a deeply satisfying stillness left in her wake. A few of us gathered in front of her former property the next day. Someone brought bagels. Another neighbor, always the comedian, suggested we hold a mock ribbon cutting for the newly freed zone. We all laughed, and in that laughter you could hear something else, relief. Relief that the petty, self-serving rulebook Karen lived by was finally closed. Not torn or burned, just irrelevant. I didn't seek out this drama. I never wanted a public showdown, viral clips, or board audit. I wanted peace, a home, and the ability to do my job without being treated like a criminal for serving the very country Karen pretended to understand. But I also wasn't going to sit back and let someone weaponize rules to control others. That's not how real communities work. That's not how real leadership operates. Today, Evergreen Pines is back to being what it always could have been. The HOA board was rebuilt with new members. Volunteers who focused more on neighborhood cleanups and event planning than citation quotas. The new president is a retired teacher who spends her days planting flowers along the walking trail. We even got a community bulletin board, where residents post everything from lost pets to bake sale flyers. No laminated threats, no clipboard tyrants, just neighbors looking out for each other. Every now and then, someone walks by my driveway and chuckles at the plaque. Some ask if it's real. I just smile and say, real enough. Because for all the madness, that little sign stands as proof that you can't bully your way into power and expect it to last. Eventually, truth rolls in like a convoy, big wheels and all. And when it does, it's got paperwork, purpose, and the kind of authority no HOA badge can outshine.